All right, glad to have you back. I want to start out by talking to you about the purpose and the application of the handbook. You have your handbook with you, and one of the things that you need to realize, and I have on the PowerPoint up in the upper right hand corner, page 3, and that'll help you to know in your handbook where to go, and you'll see different page numbers. I'm not going to be walking you through the whole handbook. I'm just going to be addressing some key components. You are responsible for all of the handbook, for the knowledge of the handbook, for understanding it, and for the applications that are given to you. So the first thing I want to point out here, and I'm going to read some of the PowerPoints for you because I want to address them as we go. Our Head Start families trust us with their children. We have a commitment to know where every single child is at each and every moment they're in our care, and we have a commitment to keep them safe, secure, and feeling loved. That whole concept flows throughout all of Head Start. Keeping them safe is just not on the bus. Keeping them safe is not just in the classroom. Keeping them safe is keeping them safe. And that literally means, sometimes we forget this, but that literally means that when you see a child that might not be safe at home, because you are mandated reporters, you need to realize that you're also keeping them safe when you see things that might be out of order in their life. And I think you understand about mandated reporting, so I'm not going to deal with that at this point. I do want to specifically make sure that you understand this on page 3. Every employee is expected to comply with each of the rules and policies discussed in this handbook, as well as any others adopted by the consortium in the exercise of its rights to manage its business. If you have questions about the rules and policies, please direct them to the consortium's Human Resources Department. You should understand that a violation of any of the consortium's rules or policies may result in discipline up to and including termination. So let me reiterate, this part of the handbook, you're responsible for all of the components in it. You're responsible for knowing it and applying it. Not applying it puts you in the position of risk of being called out for violation of policies, discipline, and up to termination. So I cannot stress any more than the fact that you not only need to know these things and apply them, but you need to realize that if you're not applying all of them in the order that they've been given, oftentimes you'll find that you're not thought of as having kept the children safe. So let's talk about a couple of things, policies and procedures, rules of conduct, and the Head Start program. All employees, regardless of title, role, primary work location, have to abide by the policies and procedures, rules of conduct, and the program site where they're presented at the site in and out of the program. Meaning that you not only have to behave as a Head Start employee during the workday, but you need to realize that you represent Head Start outside of your employment day. And so you need to be an example of that. I want to address to you this book. This book is called the Performance Standards. You probably have a copy. If you don't have a copy, you can download a copy from the eClick application under Performance Standards. You can have them that way. These are quite literally all of the laws written, the statutes for Head Start, item by item. I don't like to read all of them item by item simply because it's difficult to translate into how we utilize them. However, all of your policies and procedures are predicated on step by step every item that's in this book. And so this is the guidance that we have from the federal government. There's 2,700 Head Starts across the nation, and in these 2,700 Head Starts, each of them have to follow exactly these same statutes. Because of that, then we write policies and procedures, which is how we plan to implement all these statutes. So when you follow your policies and procedures, you're following the law and guidance as has been approved. So that's why I tell you, you need to follow these procedures exactly. The next item I'd like to address on page 4 is that we are an at-will employment state. Indiana is an at-will employment state, meaning that you have an employment agreement, but because we're at will, if either you or the consortium would choose to say that, well, it's no longer working for us, then the relationship can be terminated at any time, And it could be for reason or cause or without any reason. Simply, it's not working out for us. And so you need to be aware that this is an at-will situation. We hire you and your conditions at work may actually change at some time, and maybe because they've changed, you no longer have the will to work here and you have that freedom to move forward. I should also remind you that at the close of this training, you are required to sign a statement saying that you've been trained and that you understand your training. Even though this isn't over the whole manual, you are signing at the end that you are going to comply with 100% of the policies and procedures that are set before you. All right, so let's talk about a few basic definitions so that we have a little bit of an understanding. Number one that I want to talk about is actually listed on page 5 as number 3, grantee agency. The organization responsible for overseeing all financial human resource aspects of Head Start program in accordance with and regulations of the Department of Health and Human Services. This consortium is called a grantee. We receive the funds from the federal government to handle Head Start. Now let me explain something. A lot of people are a little confused, and I usually use this as a trick question. Since I don't have you sitting in front of me, I'm going to give you the question, help you to kind of grasp it. Who is our customer? Oftentimes in the room, I hear people say, that's our children. Our children are our customer because we're serving the children. And then because I've already said it's a trick question, others say, no, it's the families. We're serving the families because the families benefit. In actuality, our customer is the federal government. And the best way to explain this is, let me use an illustration. If you as a parent go to Walmart and you want to buy your child a pair of tennis shoes, you decide you're going to buy the tennis shoes and you're the customer because you're purchasing them. But because they're your child's tennis shoes, you decide you want to buy a red pair of tennis shoes and your child says, I want a blue pair of tennis shoes. And you say, well, no, the red will do just fine. They're the best quality. I'm purchasing them for you, and that's what you get. And Walmart agrees to sell you the best product. Walmart, in this case, is the grantee or Head Start. We agree to give the best product to our customer. The federal government is like you being the parent. They choose what they're looking for. They choose the type of tennis shoe, the quality of tennis shoe, and then when they hand it to their child, they say, this is what you get. So our children and our families are the benefactors of this exchange. We are the ones who are providing the service, like Walmart, and the federal government is purchasing it from us, but they have the standards that they set, and they say, I won't purchase your product unless you live up to the quality standards that I expect. So with that little illustration, I hope that you grasp that the federal government is who we have to satisfy. Going back to the performance standards, this is how they establish the kind of tennis shoe that I want to buy. I'm going to buy one that has all of these standards in it, and if you don't have these standards, then I'm not purchasing it. So the grantee agrees to follow all the guidelines. That's why it's so incredibly important for you to realize we have to follow all their guidelines, and if not, the grantee can lose the grant. And as you may understand, this grant in total, multitudes of grants, but the grant alone for Head Start is about $10 million here per year. So that's part of it. So now there's a structure program. We'll talk about this in other governance trainings, but we also have a policy council, the official parent or community group that's elected every year, and they're part of a shared decision making. That's part of a completely different training module, but I want you to capture the idea that policy council is part of what you're going to be working with, whether you're a teacher or a fax. You'll be working with parents because each site gets to elect at least one policy council member, and then they form the policy council, which participates in decision making, which participates in the governance aspect. And again, we'll handle that in another training session. The word program year, it's a period when the Head Start is in session, plus any time required for startup and closeout. So pretty much this goes along with the school year as a program year. It's not the fiscal year, and it's not the annual grantee cycle. Continuing here, seasoned program employee, an employee who works only during the program year. Some of you are hired as teachers and you work only during the program year. Some are hired as grantee employees, you work year round, and you need to make sure you understand the difference, because if you're a seasonal worker, you may not be employed throughout the whole year. And also site committee, we're not going to deal with that. I know it's on the PowerPoint, but site committee refers back to the parent group that's at each site, and you'll learn more about that in your governance training. Health and Human Services Department on page 6. The government provides funding for the Head Start program. That's where our funds come from. If you're wondering who supplies this, Health and Human Services is the department in the federal government, and that's where all the finances come from that support this. The next item here on page 6 is item number 2, the definition of the executive director and her responsibilities. Dr. Kathy Bajardo is your executive director. She's responsible for a lot of things. Listen closely. Developing and administrating and interpreting the policies is assigned to the executive director. Let me repeat that. It's not your role to interpret. It's not your role to develop. It's your role to implement what she has determined that needs to be followed. The executive director may delegate responsibilities for administrating established policies to some of the other management staff, but that's up to her prerogative to do that. And also, she also has the ability, for some compelling reasons, to make exceptions to any of the policies that are contained in the manual, except to the at-will employment policy. She can't change that. And when I say she can make exceptions, she cannot violate the statutes and the law, but if there is some situation where an employee maybe could use some grace, she might be able to implement grace and move a policy or adjust because there's a purpose or an extenuating circumstance. So only she has the ability to make these changes. So it's not your immediate boss. It's not the person who's directly over it. It's certainly not your responsibility to start reinterpreting or changing this manual in any way. Part-time employees. You're a part-time employee. If you've been hired as a part-time employee, you probably already understand that. You work fewer than 30 hours a week. Part-time employees sometimes in this situation find themselves gaining more hours than 30 hours per week. That does not automatically put you into a full-time work status. There is a difference in benefits between the part-time and full-time, and simply because you have the opportunity to gain more than 30 hours in a week, maybe you're a substitute teacher and you've been given that opportunity, does not automatically put you into that category. You would be notified at some point by mail if this position warrants you to be changed to full-time status, and you will be officially notified that you are in that category in a written form, and then you'll move from part-time to full-time. So if you have any questions about that, you might want to check and consult with the Human Resources Department, because it does change for your health plan and some of the other descriptions that you may or may not have. Let's talk about employee classifications on page 7, non-exempt or exempt hourly employees. If you've been hired and you're paid hourly, you're an hourly employee, you should be looking at, if it's full-time, 37.5 hours a week. But there are some employees that are called non-exempt hourly employees. They are salaried. Most of those are all working for the grantee office. If you're working in the grantee office, you'll be notified of that. And if you're working for salary, you're not on hourly, and it's pretty much you need to get your job tasks completed and whatever time frame that requires. Recruiting and staff on page 15. I jumped ahead just a little bit. Assignments will take into consideration the needs of the children in the classroom and the skills of the staff members, including but not limited to the language spoken by majority of the children in the classroom, or a group or language skills or staff members. At least one staff member assigned to the classroom will be fluent in the language spoken by a majority of the children. Let me see if I can explain this a little bit differently. When you work for Head Start, you may be asked to be reassigned to different positions for various reasons. every year, and sometimes even mid-year, we have changes in our demographics of children in the classroom. If you are not bilingual and suddenly we have a majority of students who are needing of a second teacher that has another language, it may be that you'll have to be moved to a different classroom. It's part of the process here. Don't assume that you're being moved because you've done something wrong or even because you've done something specifically wonderful. It may be that it just is required because there are changes, and the type of classroom that is being taught dictates sometimes who is in the classroom and where you're located. The same thing is true. You may have assignments that you've been given opportunity to work in one particular area, and geographically it's beneficial to you, but you have to move to another location. You say, well, that's not as beneficial to me. You have to be aware that sometimes your movement or your assignment is not always predicated on what's the easiest for you, but what works for the grantee. So just try to be reminded sometimes that there's always mobility inside Head Start. You might even get to change your job description from time to time from whatever. Still on page 15, if after the beginning of the school year there's a change in the needs of the children, the executive director has this ability to make these changes through the Human Resources Department. Once again, you see the executive director and Human Resources can make these changes. It doesn't mean that you can't apply to make changes, but the answers still come from the main office in the grantee. If the Human Resources Department executive director determined that reassignments should be made, the Human Resources Department will notify the affected staff members of their reassignment to another classroom or program site. All reassignments will be based on student and program needs, and if the appropriate in circumstances, seek to meet those needs with reassignments at the site. Again, you see here on this particular slide that that's what we're saying. It's always about the children, the families, and what the needs of the program dictate to us. So if you find yourself in that mobile status, moving from one place to another, try to recognize that it's really not about your performance, it's about the needs of the grantee and the needs of the families. So let's move on to talking about lunch. All program site employees are expected to eat lunch alongside the children at all meal times. That's not our rule, that's a federal statute. They expect you to eat with the children because you are an example to the children, both in what you eat, how you eat, and how you display yourself. Employees can bring your own food, but we do ask that you don't try to eat it in front of the children, because instantly you tell the children that, well, if I bring something from home, I don't have to eat what's in front of me. So you've got to be very careful about that. They need to be transported in bags that don't have restaurant names on them, because again, children pay attention to this. You're supposed to be eating lunch with the children, so you don't eat your lunch if you brought something on the side at the same lunch table with them. You need to eat off to the side, snack it somewhere else. Don't be obvious about it. And this is a good place for me to point out as well. You receive this training in other areas, but the refrigerator in the room is not specifically for employees. If you're going to put something in there, it must be labeled, and must be labeled with the proper date on it. And if there's an inspection of the refrigerator and you have unlabeled food in there, it will be thrown away. That's just part of the requirements of the CFP grant. And so if you have food that you brought in, it needs to be up to date, put away, and not taking up storage that the refrigerator is used for Head Start food. So be aware of that. So let's move on. I'm moving all the way to page 33. Employees are not to use your personal equipment such as cell phones during work time unless management has authorized the use of personal devices for business use. This prohibition applies to all functions of the cell phone and or personal equipment, including but not limited to camera functions, web browsing, games, audio recording, earbuds, and the like. So let's walk through some examples and illustrations here. What that's saying is, when you're in the classroom, you're watching the children. You're not on your personal phone. Of course, you're not playing games, because we know you would never do that. You're also not, ladies, tucking your hair over earbuds and listening to things. That's definitely not allowed. That's personal use of it. It also is a distraction. We're going to talk about active supervision later. And if you've got earbuds in your ears and you're listening to a program, your favorite podcast, paying attention, you're really not paying attention. Additionally, you're not making phone calls. You're not making phone calls for business or for personal at this time. In addition, because you're not supposed to be using your cell phones, if you have an emergency call from somebody that needs to get a hold of you, they shouldn't be calling your cell phone. Your cell phone should be inactive during the day. They should call your classroom, just like any regular business would be expecting those phone calls. And coming into that, then you can take the phone call, and if it's an emergency, then you can deal with it. So cell phone usage of all kinds is banned. Now, if you think that's harsh, take it up with the federal government, because they consider that to be a safety hazard, and they have it in there. This is our policy saying you can't do that, because the federal government says you've now created an unsafe situation. So I hope that I've addressed that well enough. In times past, we've asked people to put them away, put them in your purse, put them in your locker, leave them in your car, but don't use them. If you'll notify your family that you're unavailable, they'll figure it out. They'll be able to call if it's an emergency. If it's not an emergency, then just don't involve yourself in it. Let me just take a step back for a moment. In our world of cell phones, fortunately, you look at me, I'm old enough to remember when we didn't have cell phones. When we didn't have cell phones, you called the office, you got permission to talk to the employee, and then you moved from there. In our world of cell phones, we've made it so personal, we take them all day long. This is not a job where you can take a phone call all throughout the day. You just simply can't. Thank you. Let's move on. If you have to receive a personal phone call, there can be exceptional circumstances. That's where we talk about using the business phone. Don't use your personal. There are some rare occasions when you may be forced to use your personal phone for something odd. I have an example that happened a few weeks ago, and that was that tablets were not issued yet in all the classrooms, and a teacher was required to take a picture of a person who was getting an authorized pickup for a child, and they had previously been unauthorized, and they needed to take a picture. It superseded the requirement of not using your cell phone to get this picture, because we required a picture of this unauthorized person to get them authorized through the proper procedures and channels. So because of that, yes, the employee pulled out their cell phone, used it for that time period to fulfill the purpose, and then moved on. That's completely different. That covered a situation where we needed to use it. On some rare occasion, that could happen. Other than that, refer back to what we just spoke of. All right, so you also have some employees, fax and others, who have a business cell phone provided by the grantee. During work time, unless you've been told to, your business phone is not for personal use. So we're keeping that separate. And there are some occasions, because of travel, that we do allow earbuds to be used by the employees with their profession. They do need to get permission, such as driving from one location to another. It is now illegal to be on your cell phone and not have a hands-free device. And so we would allow you to use a hands-free device in those situations, but it is only after getting yourself authorized to use them. So I guess we've covered that caveat. All right, so also in the classroom, there are times that we come around, and one of them is called the health screening time. And sometimes I come around, other people come around, and we have a list either on the computer or it's on a clipboard, and we have to inspect the room. When we go around and inspect the room, you'll find we come in, we say we're doing the health screener, we open every cabinet door, we open every refrigerator, we check the temperature, we check even in the hallways the fire extinguishers. When that's being done, one of the things we often look for is, where are you storing your personal equipment? And that would be your personal items like your purse or your wallet or things of that nature. They need to be stored in a place where the children can't get to them. If I could just remind you, ladies, sometimes you have things in your purse that are harmful to children. Maybe it's makeup or cologne or perfume or something of that nature, and so it's harmful to children. So don't leave your purse or personal items sitting beside your desk. I can recall an incident where in the preschool that we had, in one location that I had, a teacher turned her back and didn't realize that she had adult scissors in her center desk drawer, and a child was rummaging through the drawer and suddenly had scissors in their hand going across the room. So be aware that children sometimes can catch you and be looking around, and we just don't want them looking through your personal items. Plus, we are not responsible for things that have been stolen, so if you'll put them away in the cabinet, especially those of you who have locking cabinets, it might be a good idea to lock them away. All right, so this is an area, we're going to talk about confidential information. You're also going to be required to sign a confidentiality statement at the close of this. And so let's talk about what it means to keep things confidential. There are applicable laws. You're familiar with the term HIPAA laws, which usually deals with children or adults and talking about any kind of a health issue. But in our situation, we often run into families who have a variety of issues, and you may be made aware of them because you're a teacher or you're a fax, so you're aware of their situation. Just because you're aware of a situation and you think that it might be something you could discuss with someone else, you've got to be very careful, because some things you're not allowed to speak about from one person to another. Let me give you a couple of examples. It might seem kind of silly, but if you have a child, and I know we've often referred to them as biters, a child is biting children. It is not for you to tell on Monday afternoon, this child was bit, and you tell the parents that your child has been, the victim of a biting child. You don't go say, well, Johnny's bit 5 other children this week or last week. You can't single out a child and tell them the background on that, because it may be that you're dealing with Johnny and he has some other personal needs, and you've now started divulging information about him. So we've got to be very careful about crisscrossing and offering information about different people that we are aware of that we're trying to assist. And so it might even be that in your assisting one, you're trying to help another. Be very careful and regard confidential information as confidential. I've just given you only one example of that, but be aware of it. Any disclosure of confidential information needs to be made within the guidelines of your policies, and you can read more about that on page 35 of your manual. The practice of confidentiality has to be maintained throughout all the departments. Now, when you're working inside the system with the grantee, it may be that you have to share this information with the social worker, a teacher, your program manager. That is okay, because we're running the program and we're maintaining confidentiality. But be aware that we're not putting it out in the public realm for people to be sharing it with one another. Staff cannot share photos. Now, let me return back to your cell phone. Some people like to take pictures of the children in the classroom and say, oh, I'd like to show this at home to my husband or my wife, or, oh, this was so cute. You're not supposed to have your cell phone out in the first place, but don't be falling prey to the temptation to take pictures of the children and share them. That's a problem. That's illegal. Additionally, some people in the past would put up on Facebook, oh, look, my children are all coloring and things of that nature. I want to kind of deviate for just a minute. A lot of people don't realize this, but in the last few years, it's really become prominently known. The United States is now the largest consumer of child pornography in the world. Because of that, and now because we have artificial intelligence, we have a struggle with people being able to take children's images and manipulate them and make them look like they're doing something they never did. When you take pictures of your children's faces and you put them on Facebook, it could put you at risk of somebody else capturing them and doing something really nefarious with them. And if you never took the picture, you never have to worry about that responsibility. So I want you to really think this through. Do not take pictures of the children. You say, well, I only take pictures of them at the back. Just don't take pictures of them. It's just not something that we want you to participate in or to treat in a casual manner. So we don't share them on any type of program. No photos or videos should be taken of any students without permission. There may be some reason that you have to take pictures, but you need to get permission. Maybe you have to identify something about a child and you have to put that in the file. You still need to get permission before you do that. Violations, unauthorized disclosure of confidential information, failure to comply. This is on page 39 of your handbook. Record-keeping procedures set out above will be subject to employee immediate termination and possible criminal and civil penalties. So if you violate some of the things we were just talking about, disclosing confidential information, taking pictures of children, you could not only find yourself terminated, but you could also find yourself in criminal or civil penalties where people want to sue you. So remember, we're trying to protect you as well. Safety in the workplace. This is both for your safety and for the children. We're on page 41 now. All accidents which include the event that's not expected, foreseen, or unintended. Okay, so let's look at this again. Every accident that happens, even if it was an unexpected, so we'll talk about that in a minute, or you could see it happening, maybe somebody intended to do something harmful or they did not intend. They still have to be reported. So let's slow down. Every accident has to be reported immediately to your supervisor. It's got to be reported whether or not you had physical damage or personal damage. So if something happened and you say, well, I don't think I'm hurt, you still need to report it. Oftentimes we have people who trip and fall and they don't think they're hurt, and the next day they discover they sprained an ankle, or heaven forbid, instead of spraining an ankle, you ended up going to the emergency room and you broke the ankle, and people say, how'd you do it? Well, I did that yesterday when I fell. Well, you never reported a fall. So you report everything, and then we'll worry about what happens after that. So it was a near miss. I almost got hurt, but I didn't get hurt. Report it anyway. Then we have a record of it, and any accidents that are near misses that turn into something else, we take care of it. Plus, if we almost had something happen, maybe it was because we had an unsafe condition. It gives us the opportunity to correct that unsafe situation. If your supervisor is not available and you couldn't report that, then go ahead and report it to the executive director, and these reports will be recorded, put away, and we'll look and see if there's any laws that we have to cross-reference with, if we have to initiate any insurance. Workers' comp insurance has to be initiated within a short period of time from the accident. Has to be an official report made. And so sometimes in this accident, compensation is required by workers' comp. And with that, you have to have the proper reports. You have to demonstrate you followed all the proper procedures. And so if we aren't doing that, we can have a problem. And that's why you find on page 41, if a near miss, almost bad accident occurred and we don't report it, you could actually find yourself being disciplined for it. Page 85, we're nearing the end of this session. As a recipient of the federal Head Start funds, the consortium must at all times comply with federal Head Start performance standards. All consortium employees are responsible for complying with the Head Start performance standards, including but not limited to the following. We're going to walk through these. All staff, consultants, contractors, volunteers will implement positive strategies to support children's well-being and prevent and address challenging behavior. In other words, we're going to use positive strategies. We're going to use positive language. We're not going to be addressing children nor our co-workers with negative attitude and negative language, disparaging remarks, and that includes everyone who's employed by the Head Start program. All staff and consultants, continuing again on page 85, will not maltreat or endanger the health or safety of children, including at a minimum these individuals must not use corporal punishment. No, we're not going to swat anybody on the rear. We're not going to do, as we heard in the past, using a ruler across the knuckles. I jokingly told my grandchildren the other day, I went to school in a time where my third grade teacher randomly walked around and racked the back of your knuckles for talking. And I said, my hands probably should have been swollen because I got whacked so many times. We don't do that here. That's corporal punishment. We don't use isolation to discipline a child. Now, isolation means we're not going to put them in the corner. We're not going to set them aside and tell them, you stay over there. Now, we have places that are safe zones. We do not address them as timeouts any longer. Okay? If the child needs to go to a safe zone for their own personal desire, that's different. But we don't isolate a child. We don't isolate them by our language. We don't tell them that you can't participate in something until you behave. We don't do that. We don't bind or tie up a child. We don't restrict their movement. And we don't tape their mouth shut. Now, you might be laughing, but there was a time we had to deal with someone who was putting tape on somebody's mouth here at Head Start some years ago because we could not, we had to deal with them because they were talking and they didn't want them to talk, so they put tape on their mouth. Lastly, we don't use food as a punishment or a reward. You think, well, sometimes we say, if you'll finish this, we'll give you a treat. We don't use food as a reward, nor do we say, if you don't eat your food, then we're going to punish you in some other way, or we're not going to let you go to lunch. Those are items that we don't allow, and those are all considered to be different forms of punishment that are not allowed in Head Start. This may affect some of you and not all of you. It's item E on page 85, using toilet and learning training methods for children. We don't demean them or humiliate them. So we don't take children who are in the midst of maybe being potty trained at the age group that you might be watching, and we don't tell all the other children, oh, they messed up their clothing, or we don't demean them for what has happened. We don't use that even as a punishment. And emotional abuse, public and private humiliation. We don't reject children. We don't terrorize children. Remember, when you start telling a child, you just wait till I talk to your parents, you just wait. Those are forms of now called child terrorism. So be very careful with how you speak to the children in this area. We don't ignore them. We don't use different types of words on them, calling them names. And so we're very, very careful. And obviously we don't in any way physically abuse a child. We do, of course, watch for physical abuse of a child, and we watch for the signs of that. We've already dealt with it, but we don't use profane language in the classroom. We don't use sarcastic language. We don't use derogatory remarks. We don't say in the classroom, now listen class, don't act like little Johnny's acting over there. That's another use of derogatory language. And finally, we don't use physical activity or outdoor time as a punishment or a reward. We don't restrict children from going to playtime. We also don't say that if you finish this, you can go to playtime. And lastly, we can't do what some of my teachers used to do, drop and give me 10 push-ups, because that'll help change things. We can't use even physical exercise as a punishment. We're almost finished with this training. All staff, consultants, and contractors and volunteers will respect and promote the unique identity of each child and family, and will not stereotype on any basis, including the gender, race, ethnicity, culture, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or family composition. So we're not going to disparage anyone for any of their lifestyle, their behaviors, or who they are, whether it's race or gender. We're not going to disparage them, and we're not going to do that on the job with our co-workers. All consultants, staff, contractors, volunteers will comply with the program confidentiality policies. I told you at the end, you need to sign the document saying that you're going to comply. And we're going to be stepping into another training here in just a few moments, but concluding this, no child may be left alone or unsupervised by staff, consultants, contractors, or volunteers while under their care. We never leave a child alone. Never. No purpose, no reason, no how, ever. We must be careful about that, and also any place that places anybody at risk in this situation is actually in violation of the performance standards, and so we're just not going to risk that. Any violations of these policies or the state performance standards, if you suspect this in your classroom, if you suspect this of another employee, you're required to report it immediately. So I know that looks like we're reporting on each other, but what happens is if we're in violation of this, we have serious problems. So even if we have a coworker who's willfully or even unknowingly violating these, one of the things we should do is make sure that our team players are all in compliance with the policies and procedures, and we're helping one another. But should someone be violating and we have to make this change, it is each employee's obligation to notify the executive director. We also have, we talked about accident reports a while ago and incident reports. They have to be filled out on the proper paperwork the same day of the event, and they need to be submitted to their manager and uploaded at the same day of the incident so that we have it on record and filed with the proper reports, the incident reports. Finally, we're going to treat one another, if we haven't already described this, it's going to be more clear. We're going to treat one another with courtesy, respect, and the professionalism that is required between professionals that work together. We're going to communicate with one another, both in written and verbal. We're going to speak to one another in proper language. We're not going to abuse one another, whether publicly or privately, with either foul language or abusive language. And at all times, we're going to conduct ourselves in a professional manner. I find it a little bit sad that we have to address it that way, but we're going to. Finally, here in this particular area, we're going to take that same attitude between our students and our families. There are times you're going to discover that families and parents sometimes may be a little bit untoward to you. We're going to treat them with dignity and respect. I don't think that we should expect that they should treat us any differently. And should someone be using abusive language, if they're speaking to you in an untoward manner, let's stop them, let's talk with them, and let's say, excuse me, I'm not treating you in this fashion. We'll work through the issue, but I would really appreciate it if you refrain from using inappropriate language, speaking to me in this manner. It's not inappropriate to say if we can't move forward in a civil manner, we'll have to stop and do this at another time. So we're not telling you you have to take abuse or be threatened by anyone else who's coming to speak to you. You need to address that and say, I'm not going to speak to you in that manner, and I would like it if you would please speak to me in the same courteous manner. On page 86, it's more of an address program of talking about what it means to be courteous and respectful, and you can read it on the screen here, including the negative impact of working environment, interfering with your workers' performance. A whole lot of reasons why we could get ourselves in trouble with this, and we could find ourselves at risk of discipline or termination. You have your standards that you understand for notifying for child abuse, but let me reiterate here on page 92, the reason to believe standards should be construed broadly. When in doubt as to whether you have to report reason to believe, make a report. Do not wait for the proof of a child to be abused. If you think a child is being abused, you use this phrase, reason to believe. I have reason to believe. If you find that the child has a handprint on their back, it looks like they've been slapped, and it's left red marks, you have a reason to believe that they might have been abused. If you find burn marks, if you find even certain actions and attitudes being displayed that there may be something said that there's a reason to believe, you have a moral obligation and you have a legal obligation to report these. It's not your job to investigate it. It's not your job to try to find out what's going on. It's your job to report it. Once it's reported, then the investigation begins. It may include speaking with you as a follow-up, but it's not your job to investigate. It's your job to report if you have a reason to believe that a child has been abused or neglected. Should that happen, it's going to show up here on the screen in a little bit. You are to call the Division of Child and Family Services first. That is your first call. But that's not your only call. If you have a reason to believe that a child's being abused, you immediately should call. The moment you hang up with Child and Family Services, you should call the Executive Director or your Human Resources Director and make sure that they're aware that you have just made this report. Because what's going to be triggered after that is the Department of Health and Family Services is going to contact the Executive Director and ask what's being implemented. We never want our Executive Director to be blindsided and unaware of the report. We don't wait minutes or hours to make that report because they're going to start the follow-up. And Dr. Kathy needs to know that this is taking place. She needs to know as many of the details as possible, and she needs to begin the investigation from within the Head Start at the same time that the Family Services are going to want the investigation. So do not hesitate in making sure that Dr. Guajardo is aware. If you're reporting this to your immediate supervisor, you should follow by saying, and you're going to report this to Dr. Guajardo, or am I going to report it to Dr. Guajardo? It must be reported to the Executive Director as soon as possible. Shows up on the screen again, confidentiality. We've already talked about that. But in this particular case, if you've turned in a report for a child for abuse, that is, again, a confidentiality item. Finally, as we wind this thing down, I keep saying that, but I'm nearly done. All employees must forward to the Executive Director all communications, whether written, oral, formal, or informal, concerning claims or reports. So any paperwork that you file, you need to make sure that those copies are also forwarded to Dr. Kathy so that she has all of the information available. I addressed this a little bit earlier in sort of a casual way. I'm going to address it one last time here. Because organizations, you'll find it on page 97 of your handbook, because organizations such as the consortium are by nature public organizations, employees are expected to have many contacts, and you will. You'll be in contact with a lot of different people, sometimes with donors, community leaders, government officials, grant applicants, grantees, and a broad range of citizens involved in and knowledgeable about the community issues. You're going to come in contact with that. The consortium is to be perceived as upstanding, forthright community leader. That's you as well. You must, during each of these contacts, consider how your actions and statements represent the consortium. Always be aware that people are thinking that you represent the consortium, so act in such a way that you would want to be representing them. And finally, here on this same concept, you should consider every contact between yourself and the public representation of the consortium and act accordingly regardless of whether the contact occurs during the course of business. You need to realize people are going to look at you always as an employee of the consortium, and they're going to assume that your behavior is representative of that. There are a few violations that you need to recognize that are subject to employee disciplinary action. Page 102, failing to comply with Head Start performance standards, including but not limited to the following: failing to provide proper supervision of the children. Obviously, that's a safety issue. Under no circumstances may a child under the care of the consortium employee be left alone or unsupervised or placed in a situation in which he or she is not properly supervised. You just can't have it happen. We'll talk about that in active supervision. Item B on page 102, failing to respect and promote the unique identity of each child and family. Consortium employees are respect all children and families. I addressed that earlier, but this is specifically speaking that if you cannot follow this, you're at risk of disciplinary procedures. Failing to comply with and enforce confidentiality information, another disciplinary issue. Failing to use positive methods for children's guidance and discipline at all times is also another disciplinary issue. If you're using corporal punishment, emotional, physical, we talked about that's not allowable. If you're caught using it, any types of emotional abuse that are recognized by the Office of Head Start, then you'll be forced to face disciplinary action. Falsifying in any consortium record, including but not limited to signing or altering employees' time records, one's own time records, or having one's time records signed or altered by another without authorization. So this talks about falsifying time records, but if you're falsifying information about a family, maybe you're trying to assist them to get into the program and you falsify information, it is an illegal action and it is subject to potential termination. Failing to refuse to perform assigned duties. When you've been given an assigned duty, and that includes even changing from one role to another or one site to another, you fail to do that, perform those duties, or you refuse to do them. If you refuse to fill out the proper forms for reports and other things of that nature, then you're violating your own job description and you're violating this particular policy and you're subject to disciplinary actions. Failing to comply with attendance and tardiness policy. You can read the policy and you can read here that you can accrue excessive number. Let me talk about this for just a moment. Every single morning we have to have substitute calling because teachers are calling off. That occurs every morning. Can't help it. We have enough employees that some are sick, some have a family emergency, something happens, and we start the sub call. They start as early as 4:30 in the morning to fill the spots when somebody's missing. Try to remember that when you call off, the sooner you know you're going to miss. Now, obviously, if you have an emergency in the morning, you don't always know that. But if you know that there's something coming up and you're going to be missing the day before, please notify as soon as possible, because that really works out how we handle and conduct our finding substitutes and keeping classrooms open, keeping children safe, and working through that. But at the same time, just because you called in, just because you notified, doesn't mean that, well, I just wanted to take a day off just because I wanted to, and I just make a habit of it, on a regular basis. Attendance and tardiness is recorded, is kept, and when you start having excessive amounts of it, you're going to be notified, and we're going to have a talk about it, and it could affect you with a disciplinary policy. And remember, we've already addressed this. This is an at-will state. It could be that we no longer can work with the absenteeism and the tardiness that you've been displaying if it's an ongoing process. Failing to comply with any of these items in the handbook obviously could cause a variety of problems of discipline, but it also includes any supplemental memorandums that come your way, any additional guidance, because in Head Start we often find that there are new rules coming down from HHS or Health and Human Services Department that change, and they may add to the policies that are listed here. So even the ones that are not listed that may come down as directives later, you're still required to comply. So we've finished the training, and we're going to ask you to fill out and sign the appropriate forms that are in your book. You can be given a separate form to sign, but acknowledging that you've received the training, you are acknowledging that you're reading throughout the complete handbook and that you're going to comply. You're going to sign your confidentiality statement and turn all of that in. And so thank you for taking the time to watch this video. We appreciate it and hope that if you have any further questions, you'll be able to contact your supervisor and find out if they can give you some additional direction. Have a great day.